The match flame trembled in the cold barn dark. Adeline raised the lantern higher, and there he was, a man asleep in the straw, snow still melting in his black hair, one boot wrapped in rags. He did not stir. She held the lantern in one hand and a fence rail in the other, and waited for the stranger to wake. 6 weeks earlier, before the snows, her husband Wesley had stood at the corral, mending a gate that did not need mending. "You judge a thing by what it does, Addie," he'd said, "not by what folks say it is." She'd laughed and called him soft. Now Wesley lay under the cottonwood on the rise, and the gate he'd fixed swung true in the wind, and she had not yet understood how much she would need to remember those words. The Half Moon Ranch sat in a fold of the foothills west of Pueblo, Colorado, where the grass ran thin and the wind never fully quit. Wesley Hart had built it from nothing across 11 years. A square house of squared logs, a barn larger than the house, 40 head of cattle, and a name that the bank in town respected. He had died in October when a horse he was breaking went over backward on the frozen ground. The doctor said it was quick. Adeline did not find that a comfort. Now it was December, and she was learning what a ranch cost a woman alone. She was 31, lean and brown-handed, raised on a farm in Kansas, and not afraid of work. But the work was endless, and built for more than one pair of hands. The cattle had drifted into the breaks and needed gathering before the deep snow. The woodpile shrank faster than she could split it. The well rope had frayed to a thread. Each morning she rose in the dark and worked until the dark came again, and each night she lay in the cold bed and listened to the house tick and settle and felt the ranch slipping through her fingers like sand. The hired man, a sullen fellow named Del Foss, had quit the week after the funeral, muttering that he'd not work for a widow who couldn't pay on time. She had paid him every cent owed and watched him ride off and told herself she was glad. There was a note from the bank in the drawer. A loan Wesley had taken in spring against the spring calves, $240, due the 1st of February. She had counted the money in the coffee tin 3 times. It came to $91 and some coins. The calves would have covered it easy if the calves were gathered and fattened and sold. They were neither. Her nearest neighbor was old Hosea Pike, who ran sheep 2 miles east and had buried his own wife years back. He came by Sundays with bread his hired girl baked, and he never said much, and she was grateful for him in a way she could not have explained. The town was Pueblo, 11 miles south, and the man who held the note was named Pruitt. Silas Pruitt, who had wanted the Half Moon's water rights for 6 years and had offered to buy when Wesley was barely cold. She had said no. She meant to go on saying no, she only did not yet know how. The storm came on a Tuesday, 3 days of snow that buried the fence posts and shut the world down to white. When it broke, Adeline went to the barn to fork hay to the milk cow and found the side door latch sprung and snow drifted across the floor. And the man. He lay in the empty stall, half buried in straw he'd pulled over himself for warmth. Big through the shoulders, dark, a stranger's face gone gray with cold. His coat was thin, and his boots were ruined, and there was a canvas roll beside him tied with rope. She did not scream. She set the lantern on the barrel and took up the fence rail and said loud, "You'll wake up now and account for yourself." His eyes opened. They were dark and steady and held no threat in them, only a great and patient weariness. "Ma'am," he said, "I meant no harm." He spoke English with the round vowels of somewhere else. Portugal, she would learn later, a fishing village he'd left as a boy. His name was Matisse Coelho. He had been walking from the rail camps north of Denver, where the work had ended, toward Trinidad, where a man had told him there might be more. The storm had caught him on the road. He'd seen her barn and judged it better than dying in a drift. "I will go," he said, sitting up slow, careful, watching the rail in her hands. "I only needed to be out of the wind. I will go now and trouble you no further." He stood and swayed, and she saw that the ragged boot was wrapped because the foot inside was frostbitten, and that he had walked on it anyway. "You'll go nowhere on that foot in this snow," she heard herself say. "You'd be dead by the creek. Then I will go as far as I can. Sit down. He looked at her. Sit down before you fall down, she said. I won't have a man dying in my barn. That's all. Don't read more into it. She brought him coffee and bread and a basin of snowmelt gone lukewarm to soak the foot, and she watched him eat the way a hungry man eats who is trying not to seem hungry slow and even, and something in her chest pulled tight that she pushed down hard. In town, they would say plenty. A widow alone, 6 weeks a widow, and a foreign drifter sleeping on her place. She knew exactly the shape the talk would take. Pruitt would hear of it. Half the county would. And the man was a stranger out of a snowbank, and she knew nothing of him but his name and the look of his hands. But his hands, she noticed, were a working man's hands, scarred and square. And when he'd finished the bread, he'd gathered the crumbs from his knee and eaten those too. And then he'd asked, quiet, whether there was stock that needed seeing to in the storm, because he could fork hay sitting down if she'd allow it. You can barely stand. I can sit on a stool and fork hay. A man should earn his bread. She thought of the 40 heads scattered in the breaks. She thought of the woodpile and the well rope, and the note in the drawer, and the long white miles of winter still to come, and the $91 in the coffee tin. You'll stay in the barn, she said at last, till the foot's fit to travel. You'll take meals at the kitchen door, and you'll keep clear of the house. Yes, ma'am, and I owe you nothing past that. No, ma'am, you don't. For 3 days the foot kept him down, and she tended it because there was no one else to, twice a day, kneeling in the trough with the basin and the clean rags torn from a worn sheet. The blackness in the two smallest toes she watched with dread, but the flesh above pinked and held, and old Hosea Pike, when he came Sunday, looked at it and nodded and said he'd seen worse come right. By the 4th day, Matthias could stand on it. By the 5th, he could walk, slow and careful, leaning on a stick he'd whittled. On the 6th morning, Adeline came to the barn to find the milk cow watered, the stalls mucked clean, an armload of split wood stacked by the kitchen door, and the man gone out into the white pasture, looking at her scattered cattle. Hosea Pike was the one who steadied her. He came that Sunday and the next, and over coffee at her kitchen table, the one place she'd allowed company. He spoke plainly. You can't run the Half Moon alone, Addie. Wesley knew it took two. There's no shame in needing hands. Folks will talk. Folks always talk. They talked when I kept on after Ruth passed. You feed a hungry man and put him to honest work and let the talk go where it pleases. He turned his cup. I've watched that fella 6 days. He works like a man building something of his own. That tells you more than any letter of character. She did not hire him so much as fail to send him away, and the difference stopped mattering by the end of the first week. It began with the cattle. The 40 head Wesley had owned were scattered through the snow-choked breaks north of the house, half-wheeled, drifting farther each day toward country where they'd winter kill. Adeline had tried twice to gather them alone, and twice the cold and the dark had beaten her back. Matthias asked, the morning his foot would bear him, whether he might try. You don't know this ground, she said. No, but cattle are cattle. In the rail camps I worked with men from Texas. I watched how they moved a herd. He paused. And you will ride with me. You know the ground. I know the cattle between us. So they rode out together into the white, she on Wesley's bay gelding, and Matthias on the old plow horse, because it was the only other mount. And across 4 bitter days they brought the cattle down. He did not rush them. That was the thing she marked. Del Foss had always rushed stock, cursing and crowding, and lost half what he gathered. Matthias rode wide and slow and let the cattle find the easy way, talking to them low in his round foreign vowels, and the herd came down out of the breaks, like water finding its level, and not one head was lost. On the last evening, driving the gathered cattle into the home pasture, as the light went violet over the snow, he said, "These are good animals. Whoever bred them knew his work. My husband bred them." He was quiet a moment. "Then he was a good man, I think. You can read a man in his animals." She did not answer, but the words sat warm in her somewhere. After the cattle, it was the well. The rope had frayed to nothing, and she'd been hauling water bucket by bucket from the creek, breaking the ice each dawn. Matthias took the windlass apart, found the drum cracked, and made a new one from a cottonwood log he sawed and bored and pinned, working in the barn by lantern light long after she'd called him to supper. When it was done, the well drew sweet and easy, and she stood watching the full bucket rise, and felt something she had not felt since October, that a thing had been not merely held against ruin, but actually made better. He fixed the kitchen door that had never hung true. He re-shinged the gaps in the barn wall where the wind whistled through. He found Wesley's tools rusting in a crate and oiled everyone, and hung them on pegs in their order. And when she saw them, she had to step out into the cold a minute, because Wesley had always meant to do exactly that, and never had. He took his meals at the kitchen door as she'd ordered, sitting on the step in the cold with his plate, and after the first week she found she could not bear it. "Come in and eat at the table," she said. "It's foolish, you freezing on the step while I sit warm. There's a chair. You said keep clear of the house. I'm saying come in. A person can change her mind." So he ate at the table after that, across from her, and they did not talk much at first. But the talk came. He told her about the village by the gray Atlantic, the boats, the salt cod drying on racks, the mother who'd died when he was 9, and the father who'd put him on a ship at 14 because there were too many mouths. He'd crossed alone. He'd worked the Boston docks, the Pennsylvania mines, the railroad west, never long anywhere, because a man who talked strange and kept to himself was always the first let go when work grew thin. "You never wanted your own place?" she asked. "Every man wants his own place." He turned his coffee cup the way Hosea did, she noticed. "I stopped letting myself want it. It is easier." She told him about Kansas, about Wesley, about the 11 years. She found she could speak of Wesley to this stranger in a way she could not speak of him to Hosea or to anyone, because Matthias had not known him. And so there was no pity in it, only the listening. The child came into it too. Not her child, for she'd had none but a boy named Tobe, Hosea's grandson, 8 years old and orphaned and living with the old man, who took to drifting over to the half-moon to watch Matthias work. The boy was forbidden by his grandfather from being underfoot and disobeyed daily, and Matthias never once shooed him off. He gave the boy small jobs and showed him knots and let him hold the tools, and the boy followed him like a shadow. And Adeline watched the two of them and felt the ranch coming back to life around her by degrees she could measure. The talk reached town, as she'd known it would. The first she heard of it was at the Mercantile in Pueblo, where she'd ridden in for flour and coffee. The storekeeper's wife, a thin woman named Mrs. Henning who'd never liked her, weighed the flour slow and said, not quite under her breath, "I hear you've taken on help out at the Half Moon, foreign help, living right on the place." "He sleeps in the barn and works for his board," Adeline said evenly, "same's as any hired man." "Same as," Mrs. Henning repeated, and smiled the kind of smile that has no warmth in it, and Adeline paid for her flour and left. She had thought it would shame her. She found, riding home, that it didn't, or that the shame mattered less than it once would have, because she knew what was true and the truth was clean. She'd fed a man out of a snowbank, and he'd saved her cattle and her well and likely her ranch, and if Mrs. Henning wanted to make something low of that, the lowness was Mrs. Henning's, not hers. Wesley's words came back to her on the cold ride. You judge a thing by what it does. Still, she was careful. She kept the proprieties exact. Matthias slept in the barn, and she made sure the whole county could see he slept in the barn. When Hosea came Sundays, she had him stay to supper so there'd be a third at the table. She did these things not for the Mrs. Hennings, but for herself, so that no part of what was growing between her and this quiet man could be called by an ugly name. Because something was growing, and she had begun to admit it to herself in the dark, and she wanted it kept clean. For it was growing. She'd watch him at the forge he'd set up in the barn, hammering a bent plowshare straight, the muscles of his forearms working, and she'd feel the old grief loosen its grip a finger at a time. He was gentle in a way that surprised her in so large a man. Gentle with the cattle, with the boy Tobe, with the broken tools he made whole. He never raised his voice. He never took more than was offered. When she thanked him, he seemed almost pained by it, as though gratitude were a coin he didn't know how to spend. One evening near Christmas, she gave him a muffler she'd knitted, blue wool, because his throat was bare to the wind and it troubled her. He held it like it might break. "You did not need to. It's cold. You needed a muffler. There's no more to it than that." But there was more to it, and they both knew, and he wound it round his neck and said nothing, and she saw his jaw work once, and turned quick to the stove. The work went on. They butchered a hog he'd bought with his first wages from a neighbor, and put up the meat for winter. He taught her a thing his mother had done with salt and cold and thyme that kept the cod they couldn't get but worked, he said, on pork. And it did, and the cellar filled. The cattle fattened on the hay they'd hauled. The boy Tobe lost his front teeth and learned to splice rope and called Matthias Matty until Hosea cuffed him for forwardness, and Matthias said, "Quiet, let him." I had no one to call me anything once, and Hosea let him. Twice Adeline rode the line of the property and looked at the water, the creek that ran year-round, the spring above it, the rights Wesley had filed in the courthouse. The first year, the rights Silas Pruitt had wanted for 6 years. The Half Moon's water was the best in that dry fold of country. Pruitt's land below it went thirsty in August. He'd offered Wesley a fortune, and Wesley had laughed in his face. He'd offered Adeline, 3 days after the funeral, a sum that would have set her up comfortable in town for life. She'd said no. She kept saying no in her mind, riding the line. The water was Wesley's. The water was the Half Moon's. And the Half Moon, she understood now, riding through the white pastures with the cattle fat and the well sweet, and the tools hung in their order, and a quiet man's smoke rising from the barn chimney was becoming again the thing Wesley had built it to be. She was not going to sell it. She was going to keep it and run it and make it pay. She had the cattle now. She had hands. Come spring, she'd have calves, and the calves would clear the note, and the Half Moon would be hers free and working. She let herself believe it. That bright, cold Christmas week, she let herself, for the first time since October, be something close to happy. That was when Pruitt moved. He came himself, in a buggy with a robe over his knees and a man on the seat beside him she didn't know. Silas Pruitt was soft and pink and pleasant, and that was the worst of him. "Mrs. Hart, I'll come to it plain. I'm prepared to better my offer. The Half Moon, stock and all, and a price that'll keep you handsome." He named it. It was a great deal of money. "It's not for sale, Mr. Pruitt." His pleasant face did not change. "I'd think hard, ma'am. A note comes due in February, I understand. $240. Winter's long. Help can be." His eyes went to the barn, to Matthias splitting his unreliable. "I'd hate to see you lose the place for $40 short on a Tuesday." He knew the exact figure. She felt cold. Pruitt did not threaten again in words. He did not need to. The pressure came after, indirect and patient, the way water finds the crack in a wall. First was the note. The Half Moon's loan had been with the Pueblo Bank, and Adeline had reckoned on the bank's slow courtesy. Wesley had banked there 11 years, and the manager, a fair man named Aldous, had always dealt square. But in the second week of January, a letter came on the bank's paper, signed by Aldous, and it was not fair at all. The note, it said, had been sold. Mr. Silas Pruitt now held the paper on the Half Moon, and Mr. Pruitt's terms required payment in full, $240, on the 1st of February, with no extension to be granted under any circumstance. She rode to town and stood in the bank, and Aldous would not quite meet her eye. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hart. He bought the note outright. It's legal. There's nothing I can do." And lower, "He's been buying up paper all over the county. Yours wasn't the only one." So that was the shape of it. Pruitt could not make her sell, so he would take the place for debt instead, for $240 on a single fixed day, and she had 91 and the calves not yet born. She did the sums 100 ways. The hog meat was eaten or put by, not for sale. The hay was forage, not cash. The cattle she could sell, but cattle sold thin in January went for a song, and to sell breeding stock to pay the note would be to gut the very thing that could make the ranch pay come spring. It would be cutting off her own legs to stand taller for a day. Then the smaller troubles began, and she understood Pruitt's hand was in them too, though she could never have proved it. The neighbor who'd sold Mateus the hog suddenly recalled he'd never been paid, though Mateus had the man's own, scrawled receipt, and made loud talk in town about the foreigner who cheated him. A length of the half-moon's drift fence came down in the night, not fallen but cut, and a dozen head got out onto the road, and it took Matthias and Adeline 2 days to gather them. 2 days they could not spare. Mrs. Henning's talk curdled into something uglier. Word went round that the widow Hart was keeping a foreign man on her place in a manner no decent woman would, and that he was likely a thief besides, and hadn't there been that business with the hog? Toby came one afternoon with a split lip he wouldn't explain, and Hosea got it out of him later. Boys in town had said things about Mattie and about Adeline, and Toby had swung at the biggest of them and got the worst of it. Matthias, when he heard, went very still. Then he said, "Maybe I should go. I bring this on you. Before I came there was talk, but not this. If I am gone, the talk ends, and you keep your name and the place." "If you're gone, I lose the place by February, sure," Adeline said. "I can't work it alone. We've proved that. You leaving doesn't save me, Matthias. It just makes me lose it quieter. Then I am the reason you lose it either way." "No. Pruitt's the reason. You're the reason I've still got a chance at all." She heard her own voice shake. "Don't you dare leave? Don't you let that soft Pinkman drive you off my place with talk?" Wesley would never have stood for being run by talk, and neither will I. He looked at her a long moment in the cold barn light. "Wesley," he said gently, "you speak his name like he is still here. He is in the place, in every gate that hangs true." She swiped at her eyes, angry. "And he'd have liked you. That's the worst of it. He'd have liked you fine." Matthias was quiet then. "I will not leave, but we must find the money. Talk we can outlast. February we cannot." They tried everything an honest pair could try. Matthias rode to 3 ranches looking for paid work he could do in the slack weeks and bring the wages home. Fence mending, breaking horses, anything. 2 turned him away at the gate. Pruitt's talk had reached them, or Pruitt's money had. The third, a hardscrabble outfit run by a man too poor to care about gossip, took him on for 4 days at 50 cents a day and a sack of seed potatoes. And that was $2 toward the note. And Adeline took the $2 and put it in the coffee tin and did not let him see how small $2 looked against the gap. She sold what she could spare that wasn't the heart of the ranch. Wesley's good saddle, the one with the silver conchos, brought $11 in town from a man who knew she was desperate and said so with his price. Her mother's brooch brought 4. The milk cow she would not sell, nor the breeding cattle, nor the bay gelding that was the only good horse. By the last week of January, the coffee tin held $109, and the gap was $131, and February was coming like the weather. She wrote to her brother in Kansas. The letter would take a week each way, and her brother was a tenant farmer with 5 children and nothing to spare. And she knew it, and she wrote anyway, because a drowning person grabs at straws. No answer came in time. She had not really thought one would. Hosea offered what he had, $42, the old man's whole cushion against his own bad winter. And Adeline refused it, and he pressed, and she refused again. "If I take your money and still lose the place, you've lost yours too, and Tobe with you. I won't do that to the boy. Keep it." He kept it, hating to, and the friendship held, and that was its own kind of wealth, though it paid no notes. Pruitt's man came round twice more, pleasant and patient, to remind her of the date and to mention each time that the offer to simply buy still stood and would spare her the indignity of foreclosure. She could walk away with money in her pocket instead of being put off with nothing. Each time she sent him off. But the second time she stood at the window after and watched the buggy go, and her hands were shaking, and she thought, he's right, he's going to win. Sell now for something, or lose it all for nothing on the first. The worst came 3 days before the end of the month. A cold snap, brutal, the worst of the winter, 20 below at dawn, and in that cold, 6 head of the breeding cattle, the ones that were her whole hope for spring calves, broke through ice on the lower creek where the cut fence had let them wander, and 2 of them she and Matthias pulled out alive, and 2 pulled out dead, and 2 they could not pull out at all. She stood on the bank in the killing cold and looked at the dead cattle and the gray water and felt the last of her hope go out of her like breath. The spring calves. The whole arithmetic of survival had rested on those calves, and now the count was short, and even if by some miracle she found the money for the February note, the ranch could no longer pay its own way through to summer. It was finished. Pruitt had won by patience and cold and a cut fence she could not prove. Matthias stood beside her, soaked to the waist and rimed with ice, his face gray. He had gone into the water for the cattle without a word, again and again, until she'd screamed at him to stop before he drowned. Now he looked at the gray creek and at her, and he opened his mouth to say something. She thought, later, it was going to be that he was sorry, that he should have mended the fence sooner, that it was his fault, and she could not bear it. Don't, she said. Don't you say it was you. Some things just are. Let's get warm before we both die out here. They walked back to the house through the blue snow, beaten, and neither spoke. That night, the note sat on the kitchen table between them like a third presence. Pruitt's terms, February 1st. $131 short, and now the calves that would have made the place pay drowned under creek ice or scattered to 7 head where there'd been 40's worth of hope. I'll send word to Pruitt tomorrow, Adeline said dull. I'll take his offer. Better to walk away with something than be put off with nothing. Wesley would understand. A live dog's better than a dead lion. Matthias said nothing for a long while. The fire ticked. He would not understand, he said at last, very low. And neither do I. But it is your place, your choice. He rose and wound the blue muffler round his throat and went out to the cold barn. She did not sleep. She sat at the table with the lamp turned low and Wesley's note in her hands and grieved. Not the cattle, not even the place, but the thing she could not name that had been growing in her cold house all winter and would end now, because when she sold to Pruitt she would have no reason to keep a hired man. And Matthias would wind his muffler and walk south to Trinidad, and the road would take him as it had always taken him, and she would be alone in town with money in the bank and nothing in her hands. You judge a thing by what it does. She thought of what the man had done, saved her cattle, made her well draw sweet, hung Wesley's tools in their order, taken a fatherless boy and given him knots and a name to call him, gone into killing water for stock that wasn't his again and again until she screamed, asked nothing, took nothing, eaten the crumbs off his own knee that first day because a man should earn his bread. The whole county called him a thief and a foreign drifter and worse, and she had nearly let their talk become the truth in her own mouth, had nearly used him as the reason she'd lost when he was the only reason she'd nearly won. She set down the note. Wesley had built this place from nothing across 11 years. She would not give it to Silas Pruitt for the price of being afraid. There had to be another way. She would find it. She found it at dawn, and it had been in front of her the whole winter, the water. Pruitt did not want the Half Moon's house or its cattle or its hay. He wanted the water rights, the year-round creek, the spring, the rights Wesley had filed in the courthouse the first year. They were worth more to Pruitt's thirsty bottomland than the whole ranch besides. He'd offered a fortune for the place to get them. She didn't have to sell the place to settle the note. She only had to sell what Pruitt actually wanted, a share of the water he'd been dry for, and keep the land, the house, the cattle, and everything else that was Wesley's. She woke Matthias at first light, breathless. I've got it. Saddle the bay. The thing Wesley had filed in the courthouse the first year was not. It turned out, a single right but a generous one. The Half Moon held senior claim to far more creek and spring flow than 40 head and a kitchen garden could ever use. Wesley had filed wide because Wesley filed wide on everything meaning to grow into it. He never had. The surplus had run down the creek and across Pruitt's parched bottomland for 6 years, free, while Pruitt schemed to own the source. Adeline understood now why Pruitt wanted the whole ranch and not just a deal. A deal she could refuse, but a foreclosure he controlled. He'd never made an honest offer for the water alone, because he meant to take everything for the price of a debt. Her answer was to make the honest offer herself, but she did not ride to Pruitt. She rode with Matthias beside her to the 3 ranches in the dry fold below the Half Moon, whose land went thirsty every August, the same as Pruitt's. Men who'd turned Matthias from their gates, some of them, but men who needed water all the same and had no love for Silas Pruitt, who held their notes too and squeezed them the same way. At each gate she said the same plain thing. The Half Moon had senior water it didn't use. She would sell perpetual shares of the surplus flow, a fair share to each, filed legal at the courthouse, priced so that any working man could meet it, and the water would run to their land by right, instead of by Pruitt's grace or against his greed. She would keep the source, the land, the cattle. They would get the one thing that could save their summer hay and their own herds. And Pruitt, who wanted to be the only man with water in that country, would wake to find every ranch around him watered and free of him. The first man laughed at her, a widow and a foreigner peddling water. The second listened and said he'd think. The third, the hardscrabble man who'd given Matthias 4 days' work and seed potatoes when no one else would, did not think long at all. Pruitt holds my notes same as yours, he said. He's been waiting on a dry August to break me and buy me cheap 6 years now. You're telling me I can have water that beats him without owing him a cent? He spat. How much? She named a price. It was fair. He had it, scraped from a hard winter's hidden corners, and he counted it into her hand at his own kitchen table, and that was $80. The second man, hearing the third had bought, came round within the day and bought a share, too. That was 90 more. And the first man, who had laughed, when he saw his 2 neighbors would have green hay all August while his own went brown, when he understood that the water would flow whether he bought or not, and he could be inside the arrangement or outside it, rode to the Half Moon on the 31st of January, hat in his hand, and asked, not laughing now, whether there was a share left for him. There was. That was $70 more. $240 sat on Adeline's kitchen table on the morning of the 1st of February. She had not sold 1 foot of Wesley's land. She had not sold 1 head of his cattle. She had sold water that had been running away free down the creek for 6 years, and in selling it she had bound 3 struggling neighbors to the Half Moon by their own interest, and cut Silas Pruitt off from the country he meant to own, all in a single stroke. She rode to Pueblo with Matthias beside her and the money in a leather pouch against her breast. Pruitt held the note. The note was payable to whoever held it. She would pay it to his face. He received them in his pleasant office with the stove too warm. His pink face did not change when she counted the $240 onto his desk in full, but something behind it did. A small collapse, quick and hidden, the look of a man who has played a long, patient game and lost it in a morning to the one move he hadn't troubled to guard. You'll want a receipt, Adeline said, marked paid in full, and the note itself surrendered. Here, now. He wrote it. His hand was not quite steady. He pushed the receipt and the surrendered note across the desk, and Adeline read both careful, twice before she folded them away. Where'd a widow find $240 in a hard winter? He asked, and tried to make it pleasant, and could not. I sold some water, Mr. Pruitt. She let that sit. She watched him understand it, watched him understand that the surplus flow he'd schemed 6 years to own had just been sold out from under him to the very neighbors he'd meant to squeeze, filed legal, perpetual, beyond his reach forever. Senior rights, filed at the courthouse this morning. Your bottomland neighbors hold shares now. Good water. every August. I expect you'll find them harder to buy cheap going forward." Pruitt said nothing. There was nothing pleasant left to say. Outside, in the cold, bright street, Adeline stood the courthouse steps with the paid note in her coat and felt the winter break inside her like ice going off a creek in spring. Matthias stood beside her, the blue muffler at his throat. He had said almost nothing through all of it. He'd ridden to every gate beside her, stood at her shoulder while she dealt, lent her his quiet bulk and his steadiness, and asked for no part of the credit. "It's done," she said. "The place is clear. It's mine. It is yours," he agreed. "You did it. You saw the water when no one saw it." He looked down the street, south, the way the road ran toward Trinidad, and she saw him go to do the thing he always did, the thing the road had always made him do, to thank her and take his leave before he could be sent away. "Don't," she said, before he could. He stopped. "You said once you stopped letting yourself want your own place because it was easier." She made herself look at him. "I've got a place, Matthias. It's cleared and it's working, and it's far too much for one pair of hands. Wesley always said it took two. I'm not asking you to be him. I'm asking you to stay, to build something of your own here. With me, if you'll have it, as a partner, and in time, if it's right, as more." The road ran south behind him. He did not look at it again. "I have walked a long way," he said, his voice rough. "Looking for a place a man could earn the right to stay. I did not think I would find it asleep in a stranger's barn." He took her hand. "I will stay, Adeline, gladly, for all of it." A year on, it was spring, and the cottonwood on the rise was greening over Wesley's stone. Adeline stood at the corral in the morning light. Matthias was mending a gate that hung true already, the way Wesley used to. Because a man who builds looks always for the next thing to make better. The boy Toby perched on the rail, handing him pegs, gap-toothed and chattering. Down in the dry fold below, the neighbor's hay ran green and certain, fed by the creek that no longer ran to waste. New calves nosed at their mothers in the home pasture. The well drew sweet. Wesley's tools hung in their order in the barn. She had judged the man by what he did in the end, and what he did was save everything and stay.